So I'm not going to keep you waiting. I'm going to jump straight to what I'm showing today, which is a replica of the A-10 Thunderbolt 2. I looked at multiple references and sources and tried to get the best bang for my buck replica with a smaller part count. In terms of aesthetics, I did have to compromise on functionality ever so slightly. This thing does not fly amazingly, but it does fly pretty well. Ignore the lift indicator, the center of lift indicator, that's lies anyhow. It flies decently. But yeah, I'm quite happy with how I got the rotary gun looking up here. We got a cubic strut holding 8 symmetry-wise communicatrons inside of this other communicatron to make the gun barrels. The real thing only has 7 barrels, though, I learned, and an ore tank that also facilitates that look. And here's another thing. To get the landing gear on the wing in the right position, I actually needed to fill the ore tank to bring the center of mass forward. I suppose I could have also filled the cockpit with monoprop, but since the ore tank was already being used for the Gatling, I decided that would be a better way to lift it forward. Also, you can see, of course, the front landing gear is offset for the gun to remain centerline on the firing barrel, just like a real one. The cockpit is kind of stubby-nosed intentionally, and I think I got this kind of sleek taper down into the fuselage pretty decently. Maybe not the best, but I'm pretty happy with it. I'm also very happy with the vertical and horizontal alignment of the engines, the alignment of these not pylons per se, but yeah, obviously this isn't gonna quite be the real thing. I mean, if it was the real thing, this landing gear here would be the actual landing gear, and the landing gear would stick out slightly. We don't have parts like that exactly. I could, of course, modify that to make that work, but this felt more faithful and functional at the same time. Putting these backwards is a little strange. Also, having an intake be backwards with this, you know, it's a little strange overall, but overall I feel it captures the shape pretty well. I also, there's a very interesting thing. If you look at blueprints very closely, you'll see that this is slightly inboard of the tail plane, the vertical tail planes, and it's a U-tail. I hadn't thought about that before. It's a U shape. But anyhow, I wanted to get this lined up nicely, which means that these actually go almost all the way through to clipping through the other side. This brings the wing in quite a bit more, and I actually originally had just this outer board section of wing, but then I realized that made the wings not long enough. And then, of course, I've put all the stations underneath, and I've also enabled fuel cross-feed on stations 4, 6, and 8, which is 4, 6, and 8. Actually, I think it's left to right, not right to left, but I was facing the craft, so I did it backwards. And let's see, yeah, the tail, I'm very happy with the tail. The tail is tilted down quite a bit, and that's in order to get the flight dynamics to stabilize a bit. Had a little trouble with that, and I feel like this combination of elevons and landing gear to make the kind of proper vertical stabilizers, I feel works quite well. And also this tailpiece, you can tell it is slid forward into the fuselage slightly to bring the tail forward, because the tail was sticking out a bit too far. I also tried to maintain the fact that the real thing has a bit of a gap between the rear engines and the tail, and the intakes of the engine pods, the nacelles, go over the back of the wing. Again, that's also where I was trying to get the landing gear roughly right. They may be a little far forward, but the main thing for me is that I needed the landing gear to be behind the center of mass on this, and I don't remember exactly how the center of mass moves as you drain all the fuel, but it should stay relatively near that spot. I'm going to go ahead and drain this real quick just to show. And of course it drains evenly from all tanks, so even though I'm draining it from the back forward, you'll notice the end result is that the center of mass is pretty much where it was, maybe slightly further back. And so during normal usage, that drains out pretty well. If I didn't have the ore tank set up, you can see the center of mass goes to directly above those wheels, and you'll see when I go to put this on the ground that would be an issue. That's an issue even with the ore tank completely filled. But before we get to that point, I like to show the design process, but I don't always get good saves for that. In this particular case, however, I did get some pretty good saves, I feel. So the first variant, I just wanted the basic idea. I figured I was going to use a tail connector on the back. I actually thought I was going to use this, but you can see how the NCS adapter is pushed further into the fuselage, and so is the nose cone slightly. I thought I was going to try to get the right look with that. Obviously, that didn't hold up. I knew the nacelles would be these engine nacelles, and I also knew that like this was going to be on a different section from this and this, and I just wasn't quite sure how that was all going to play out just yet. And in the second version, I already realized my mistake with trying to use that other nose cone. I also realized that in order to get the right stubby front-end look, I would need to place the cockpit above the main fuselage and have kind of a tail, this tail connector going down. You can see it's not placed quite correctly because I wasn't quite sure where I was going to go from this, and I was saving variants just in case things went wrong. You can see I've actually already finished the engine nacelles at this point. The engine nacelles are slightly clipped more than they would be if you just place these items normally, as you can see right here. The reason for that is that these are kind of long, and to get the kind of stubby look of those nacelles, I wanted to clip them in slightly, but if I clip them any further on the front here, what will happen is you'll start getting Z-fighting on the interior here, and that just doesn't look good. Also, of course, the more you push it in, the more this transition here becomes more noticeable. And it's a similar issue on the back, although back here it's more that it becomes apparent that like you can see that it's obviously clipped in quite horribly. On the finished nacelles, it's clipped in slightly to I think somewhere around here, so there definitely is some noticeable clipping, but I think it looks okay. Obviously you're also only going to see that if you're really looking for it, but still, I try to avoid those things. And at this point, I wasn't sure on the tail, so I removed it, and I was working on adjusting this to the right level, and also trying to get the engines at the right level with the cockpit. This was a very difficult thing to get right. They're actually too high right here because they're actually lower than the top of the cockpit on the real thing, which is kind of amazing and hard to notice if you aren't specifically looking for it. Obviously, there's quite a big jump to the next version. I did a lot of steps and didn't really... I made some mistakes with saving things. You can see I already have the GAU on the front. I already have the landing gear. I already have... you can see the wings aren't long enough right here. Like I was saying, I originally started with just these two pieces. And you can see I had an Elevon 3 on the back here. And this does make the outer wing thicker than the root wing, which is a problem because that's not how it works. And so it looks wrong. And also you can see the engines are, of course, too far forward, and our center of mass is really close to those landing gear, and that's why I ended up, like I said, I ended up filling this with ore to bring it forward. But I needed to lengthen the fuselage, but at the same time keep the engines a little farther forward than this and move the wings, or keep the wings about the same or move them slightly forward. I believe this also, I didn't have the adjustment on the tail here. And what this means is that the tail actually clips if you have elevon deflection and rudder deflection. Elevon? Elevator deflection, not elevon. Elevons are aileron elevators. We don't have those on an A-10. But I don't like having control surfaces that clip in motion. That's one of the things that's very icky to me. So on the 5th work in progress version, I have added an extra fuselage piece. The engine pylons are in a better place. You can see the tail connector has been moved forward. This is basically the done configuration as far as major components. However, you can see the ore pod still isn't quite filled, and actually at this stage, the center of mass without the ore tank is directly over those landing gear, which in effect would probably cause this to actually tilt backwards, because KSP is a little weird about where the quote-unquote center of mass or center of the wheels are. It's not literally where they appear to be. It seems to be more about the center of the wheel part. I don't know why the physics act that way. It's just something I've always noticed. I need to place the full landing gear behind the center of mass in order to avoid the plane tilting backwards, because if it's only partially behind it, sometimes it just does it anyhow. It's very strange like that. Also, before I go to the next one, I just want to show the... oh, there we go. Yeah, the center of lift is showing quite a bit closer to the center of mass, but it's also still substantially enough off that I knew I was going to have to adjust the rear elevator or adjust everything. And obviously adjusting everything wouldn't get the design looking correctly. So in the work in progress 6, we have... Oh yes, I have redone the wings, so at this point you can see the Elevon 3 was replaced with these Elevon 4s, and we have this extra wing connector type C, making the wings the correct length. So now we got that very nice iconic little sweep. And also, it may have been in the previous version, it may not have, but the thing that I was talking about where I was very careful to make sure that this section where the landing gear is inboard of the U-tail, that was a very important feature. I believe the engines are at the right height now, although looking closer, I believe they're a little too high still, so that probably got tweaked. At this point I have the front landing gear on, and I believe this was the first... No, this was not the first one to get fueled. I was still not quite sure on my positioning of things, or maybe this was just my last little save before fueling her up. In fact, I believe... No, that's pretty much the only difference noticeable at this point. Possibly I started rigging these up because they previously were all set to their default settings, which is, you know, everything enabled. And this would be the first one that has fuel, and you can see that it's actually well balanced enough to where everything has fuel. I probably also, filled the ore at this point, so this was the first one that I attempted to fly with. I believe it also still has a completely straight tailplane, which I believe the indicators show might work, might not. I don't remember exactly how it flew, I just remember that it didn't fly good enough. You can see at this point that the part count isn't going to change. In fact, this is the last one before I have to scroll up to the 10, 11, and 12. But you will notice there's a slight angle on the tailplane at this point. Actually, it doesn't quite look like it. I might have been trying to correct the configuration on these Elevons, because these Elevons are set up for flaps, specifically these 3 and that one. And the work in progress 10 has a slight increase in this angle, even if the other one didn't. And that's pretty much the trend for the next couple of edits. You can see this angle back here, if you look closely, is slightly increased. And then again, on the work in progress 12, you can see it's increased yet again. Obviously this doesn't have the pylons on it, but other than putting the pylons on it, the weapon stations, this one's pretty much done. And so going back to the fully finished product, you can see, like I said, the tail is angled in a little bit. I'd actually need to look at the real one again to see just how far off this is from the real thing. It might not actually be as far off as I thought. It also might benefit it to come slightly more forward, close the gap slightly between the engines and the tailplane, and also give us a little bit more of this nub at the end, because there is a tiny nub sticking out the back, but also I'm not worried about that. There is one other major feature that I've completely forgotten about and actually need to apply to this design right now, and that's in utility. If you look up an A-10, you will find this particular ladder design. The developers didn't just, put this in as a joke or whatever, or like, oh, this looks neat. I believe it's used on multiple things, so I can't just claim that, oh, this is an A-10 specific thing, but I can tell you that the A-10 definitely is one of the... Oops, wrong button. This is clipping slightly. You know how I am about clipping. I mean, it sticks out quite a bit, but then again, the A-10 never was an exactly pretty plane. Yeah, an attempt at a rather faithful replica in appearance. Unfortunately, this does limit performance somewhat. Toggle flaps, and the abort ejects all stations. Stations 4, 6, and 8 can be used for external fuel tanks and thus have crossfeed enabled, as I already mentioned. Now, let's go ahead and fly this. Oh, yes. So I have killed or sent all of my Kerbals on a mission. So we'll get a new batch of victims, throw a scientist into the cockpit, and launch this baby. And as you noticed, it did do a little happy bounce on the runway before getting ready to go, and it also backed itself up slightly. I'm going to go ahead and deploy the flaps so you can see those in action. Also, one of the neat features of the A-10 is that the ailerons double as speed brakes by splitting open. And wow! This plane did not like me doing that during takeoff. I wonder why. It actually makes quite a bit of sense that it wouldn't like me doing that, but that was pretty fun to find out nonetheless. Like I said, these operate as speed brakes and ailerons, and sure enough, I have done that in KSP, so yeah, I'm very happy with that. Also, the elevators and rudders are specifically authority limited. Well, the rudders are, so that they do not interfere like that. Anyhow, let's go ahead and get ourselves a little bit of throttle. Go ahead and engage the SAS. I want to get up this hill. Will that do it? Yeah, that'll do it. Just barely. Go ahead and throttle down just a little bit. And get us lined up again for a takeoff before I throttle up all the way. Okay, pretty much lined up. Going to switch SAS real quick just to make sure we got a good steady set. And now I'm going to go ahead and throttle up. I've already done it, obviously, but yeah. My voice is a little slower than my hands, and also just to demonstrate, there goes all of the weapon stations immediately. We're also going to go ahead and take off at around... What speed does it take off at? I'm not actually sure. Apparently about 100 is when we can lift off. That's with the flaps down. I think it actually probably would lift off quicker with the flaps up, just because of how KSP physics works. Flaps are more about looking cool than being useful, I find. And like I said, this doesn't have the best performance. Here's a little... This is basically a barrel roll. It's not a very effective barrel roll. Might work a bit better if I had more lead up to it. Let's go ahead and let's level out slightly. And now let's do a barrel roll. Yeah, the barrel roll is very much more like an aileron roll than a barrel roll. It doesn't have great pitch authority. You can see I'm turning, but my turning radius is rather slow. But, you know, she's never meant to dogfight. And like I said, this design was really based on trying to go for a more realistic A-10, and in terms of the aesthetic, more than functional. And I wanted to be functional, but the design, the aesthetic, was more important to me than the exact function, so she does lose some points on there. You can see I have some other stuff parked here to show off. I have plenty of things to come. There's a little preview, if you could spot anything in that. One of the things you might have noticed in that arraignment of vehicles is another one of these A-10s. That one doesn't have the ladder on it, but it does have the pylon still on board, and yes, my game is still flickery, which is unfortunate, but oh wow, our throttle control is our minimum throttle for sustained flight is pretty good. Also, I love that I can see the wingtip from the cockpit, so I can see if I deploy the brakes. Anyhow, I'm going to do a maneuver, so I'm going to go ahead and throttle up for the maneuver just so that we don't lose too much speed. In fact, we're going to gain speed slightly while doing this maneuver. And this maneuver is to line us up for a runway landing. I'm going to go ahead and try to do that. I'm not going to use the flaps because who needs flaps, really? And I guess I'm doing it from the cockpit because here I am in the cockpit, and I'm definitely... This obviously isn't the best lineup for the runway, but it's good enough for me right now. I'm going to go ahead and cut my throttle entirely because I have more speed than I want, and in fact, I just remembered I have air brakes, so I'm engaging those a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and throttle up ever so slightly just because 100 was our takeoff speed, so I don't want to go too far below that for our landing. Obviously, we're experiencing a little bit of lag as those aircraft load in that are very close to the runway. Okay. And I did not line up very well for this. Okay, cut throttle, speed brake on, pull up, flare it gently. I'm coming down very crooked, but you can see we have a pretty stable landing other than a little bit of drifting. But yeah, go ahead and disable SAS. Throttle up slightly just so that we're not rolling backwards. And I'm gonna get us turned around. Actually, yeah, since I actually stopped the craft short of the other aircraft over here. I can go ahead and go look over at them. Oh, you can't really see... Oh, you can see the tiniest edge of when I deploy the flaps, but not really from in here. In any case, like I said, I'm gonna just go on over here and we can give you a beef preview, a beef preview of the finest cuts and selects that will be available for the next videos, missions, etc. Yes. I shall recover this and the other A-10, or crash it spectacularly, and then put another one out on the island, since I started collecting planes in the hangar on the island runway, because for some reason I just like to collect planes and park them now. I don't know why, I just started doing this. Maybe I should start, like, instead of collecting them in all in one place, because that does destroy frame rate, obviously. Maybe I should start collecting them in a different location, and that might be a good idea. This is a redo of an old design of mine, the K-38, I believe it is. There's the other A-10, like I mentioned. This is a redo of a GI-22, which was an old modded plane I made, and this one's stock. And those are, in the background, those are some older designs that I did that I just never got around to making a video of, and so I kind of parked them out here to remind myself, like, hey, you never did a video on these. Maybe you should do a video on these. And you can see, like I said, I deployed my flaps here, so... Oh, and this is, this is an old Strikebreaker 100. So I dug up and found one of my older versions of that plane, which is, the 100 was because it was in the 1.0.0 release. And, what better way to name it at that point than that? And I disagree with its aesthetics now, because, like, look at this elevon that's just kind of clunked onto the back of the wing here. It's not conformed to the design like the aileron and flap on this GI-22 over here, and I'm not so angry about the winglet being clipped into the wing like that, but still it's a bit weird. The way the fuselage is very disjoint with the way the intakes and these nacelles and the air brakes and the fuel lines were necessary because back then the way I put it together broke the fuel flow. Speaking which of, I don't believe I checked to make sure that the fuel flow isn't broken on this, but there's no reason for it to be, because there was no weird fancy shit happening along the fuel flow path, and sure enough, it's just fine. So yeah, thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you in space. I do want to see how well this ladder works, so we're gonna go ahead and do that. And apparently doesn't work at all. Okay, what about for getting back up? Obviously we can climb up this part, but can we transition to the other ladder? Oh, we can! Alright, so at least it's good for getting back up. Very nice. Thanks for watching, and as always, I will see you in space. I already said that part, didn't I? Let's put the... because I want to look down the barrel for the thumbnail.